Hi everyone, I'm Luke Peterson, and welcome to the last of three courses in the series, A Survey of Western Art. We're going to be exploring art, society, politics, and culture in the Western Hemisphere from the Rococo, which begins roughly in the 18th century, all the way up to the art produced today, our contemporary art world. It's going to be quite a journey. But in comparison to the previous courses in this series, we're going to go slower, which means you'll have more time to absorb the material and do the readings. Today, we start with the Rococo, which is an era most well known for the Enlightenment and for its revolutions, pivotal events that secured the political systems and the state of scientific advancement that we know today. At the beginning of the century, the West was still semi-feudal economically and politically, with wealth and power centralized amongst the aristocratic elite, who owned the land that was worked by an enormous class of the poor. There were relatively few privileged enough to belong to a middle class. Now, by the end of the century, the situation had changed drastically. A new source of wealth brought on by the Industrial Revolution expanded the middle class, and visionaries imagined a world with a better material existence for all classes that extended beyond economic concerns into equal rights and opportunities. It is in this milieu that the American Revolution of 1776 and the French Revolution of 1789 sprang forth. These developments in politics and economics were largely manifestations of a vast political revolution known as the Enlightenment, which was radically this new synthesis of ideas about humanity, reason, and nature. If you were with us last term, you're quite aware of the lasting impact of humanism and scholasticism, but this current of philosophic thought carried a generally optimistic view that humanity and its system of institutions could be reformed, if not perfected. You may even be familiar with some of the intellectual giants of this period. Uh, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Denis Diderot, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and Immanuel Kant. So essentially, there are three artistic styles that come out of the Enlightenment. Two of which we will look at today: Neoclassicism, Rococo, and Romanticism, which we'll get into next week. Neoclassicism, which was basically the revival of ancient Roman and Greek styles, was conceived as a visual means of pleasing the senses and teaching moral lessons, the most didactic of which was the genre of history paintings. Rococo, a word synthesized from the Portuguese word for an irregularly shaped pearl, and the French word for an artificial shell or rock ornament, came to describe the sophisticated, lavish, and playful style popular in France. Okay, well, here are some things I want you to take away from this week's lecture and reading. As we examine Rococo works, take note of its origins and the spread of the luxurious decorative style. As we follow the philosophical and philological developments of the 18th century, you should be able to discuss the fundamental changes in European and American tastes in art. Then, you should also be able to explain the causes and characteristics of neoclassical art and architecture in Europe and America. Finally, you need to be able to visually and verbally differentiate the subject matter and stylistic features of Rococo and neoclassical art. All right, let's finally get started, shall we? We start by exploring interior spaces, of those who embraced the Rococo style. And we find that the style itself is best characterized by its delicately curving forms, pastel palette of colors, and light-hearted mood. It was in many ways a reaction on all levels of society to the art identified by the formality and rigidity of the 17th century court life. Think back to the reign of Louis XIV and his court at Versailles, or even flip back to our chapter on the Baroque in Northern Europe. We're looking at a prime example of this by the Duke of Orleans, who made his hotel, which is French for townhouse, in Paris instead of Versailles. These aristocratic residences became lavish settings for intimate and fashionable intellectual gatherings and events called salons, which were hosted by accomplished, educated women of the upper class. This room exemplifies the lightness and delicacy of the Rococo design. The typical elements of architectural decoration, such as arabesques, S shapes, C shapes, reverse C shapes, volutes, and naturalistic vegetal forms. Notice the glimmer of silver and gold against the expanses of white and pastel color. The visual confusion of mirror reflections, delicate ornament in sculpted stucco and carved wood panels. The influence of the Parisian style radiated across Europe, and our book gives us a few examples of how it took shape in Germany. Here in Schloss Nymphenburg, just a short train ride from the Munich Central Station, Rococo was adopted enthusiastically, and the designers took particular care to observe its French roots. See the characteristic combination of metallic and white or pastel color, and the typical use of form and vegetal design. The name of this room in the Amalienburg portion of the palace is aptly the Hall of Mirrors, after not only its decadent use of mirrored surface, but also after the famous Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Both utilized the form of mirrored surfaces to add to the architectural unity and symmetry of the room, as well as the overall illumination. But there are key differences in the other wall and ceiling surfaces. The more intricate, thinner, complex, organic tracery combines with the lighter color scheme and expanse of the white ceiling in the Nymphenburg Hall of Mirrors to convey a lighter, airier, laissez-faire mood. Okay. Now, I would just like to quickly show you the work of another prominent German Rococo architect, Balthasar Neumann, who was active in Würzburg. It's just another great example of the imitation of the Parisian Rococo. Metallic, in this case gold and silver, set against white and or subdued pastel colors, well illuminated with a light, airy feel. This is again another private residence, but the style was appropriated into religious spaces as well. Here, Neumann is showing off his education, taking advantage of not only French architectural elements, but borrowing from the Italian Baroque as well. Recalling Borromini's design of the Church of San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, Neumann's layout is based on six interpenetrating oval spaces of diverse sizes around a dominant ovoid domed center. The interior of Vierzehnheiligen overlays decoration to create a visionary world where flat wall surfaces scarcely exist. The elaborate shrine that you're looking at in the middle was built over the spot where a shepherd had visions of the Christ child surrounded by 14 holy saints in the 15th century, hence the name of the church, Vierzehnheiligen. Rococo painting was, like architecture, predominantly shaped by French tastes, and Jean-Antoine Watteau epitomizes, at least for many scholars, the French Rococo style. He had a real proclivity for representing beautifully dressed individuals in idyllic scenes, light, airy, carefree, and sometimes so acutely that his scenes are often imbued with wistful overtones of melancholy. This painting shows us an idealization of his art dealer's gallery, filled with paintings from Venetian and Netherlandish schools that Watteau admired. The visitors to the gallery are elegantly dressed, at ease in their surroundings, and seemingly knowledgeable about the paintings. And thus we have an atmosphere of aristocratic sophistication. Yet there are many, many subtle, enigmatic, symbolic features that tell us that there's more going on here. The woman at the left, in pink satin, steps across the threshold, ignoring her companion's outstretched hand as she is absorbed in the packing of a portrait. While one of the porters carries a mirror, the other is lowering a portrait of Louis XIV into a wooden case, which is, well, which on one hand may be a reference to the name of the art shop, Au Grand Monarque, or the Great French King, or the Great King. But on the other hand, it may suggest the passage of time. Mind you that King Louis XIV had just died 5 or 6 years before Watteau painted this. There are a large number of other elements that suggest transience. Note the clock on the left positioned strategically over the king's head, which is surmounted by the allegorical figures of Fame, who shelters two lovers. It is a clear use of memento mori, a reminder of mortality. I mean, we all know how fading love and fame can be. There are also, for example, the emblems of straw in the foreground, which is easily destroyed, and the images of young women gazing into mirrors, which is a time-honored symbol of the fragility of human life. Finally, it is significant that Watteau painted this in his last days. He was dying of tuberculosis as he made these final brushstrokes. Seen today, the work was prophetic of the detachment of the aristocracy, its dissolve, and the French Revolution to come, and the ephemeral nature of life. Okay, we have to keep moving. I would be quite remiss if I weren't able to at least briefly introduce you to Fragonard and Boucher. Francois Boucher actually was most commonly associated with Parisian Rococo in its height. After studying at the French Academy in Rome, Boucher settled in Paris and eventually worked almost continuously decorating the royal residences at Versailles and Fontainebleau. In Cupid Captive, Boucher gently mocks the boy goddess of love, Cupid, who gets caught in his own snare. Instead of Cupid wounding the hearts with his flaming arrows, now he's the prisoner of several women in a garden of pleasure. Jean-Honoré Fragonard was Boucher's student, and his influences are very apparent. At first glance, The Swing depicts a pleasant afternoon outing as a man pushes a woman on a swing and a young man sits in front and quote unquote innocently watches. Nearby, the putty statues observe the entertainment as if they were alive and ready to partake. The woman's luminous pink dress holds the viewer's attention as she flies through the air, suspended in her pleasure at the climax of her swing, and is enjoying herself so thoroughly that her shoe flies off. Clearly, Fragonard conveys a not so subtle erotic subtext for this painting. But the unintended subtext for us today is that the rich lived in blissful isolation, cushioned by their pleasures from the trials and tribulations of the poor struggling all around them. Actually, 22 years after this was painted, the French Revolution unleashed the pent-up resentment of the underclasses, and by the time the sensual Rococo paintings had fallen out of favor, Fragonard was living in poverty. Okay, I want to move now to England, where a whole different set of socio-political conditions shaped the expression of art. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, which was accompanied by and powered by the scientific and philosophical movement of the Enlightenment. Coalbrookdale was a town fairly typical of the new industrial environment, with factories and workers' homes filling the valley, and it was here that Abraham Darby III built the Seven River Bridge that represents one of the first uses of structural metal on a large scale, with iron replacing the heavy hand-cut stone voussoirs. In this bridge, cast iron arches span the 100-foot gap and become not only an economical and functional structure, but the material elements are not hidden or ornamented. They bear themselves and become beautiful in their own right. This unintended new aesthetic created by the open, light, skeletal structure was adopted quickly by builders and slowly gained acceptance in artistic circles and became a landmark in architecture. Without this turn in aesthetic, we wouldn't have structures like the Eiffel Tower, which even then wasn't wholly accepted initially. The Enlightenment concern with the natural sciences is seen in this dramatic painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, who painted almost exclusively for self-made entrepreneurs of the first wave of the Industrial Revolution. Wright belonged to the Lunar Society, which attempted to popularize science, and thus he painted a series of quote-unquote entertaining scenes of scientific experimentation, like this one. The second half of the 18th century was an age of rapid technological advances, such as the Iron Bridge. And the development of the air pump was among many innovative scientific developments of the time. As depicted here, air was pumped out of a large glass bowl until the small bird inside collapsed from lack of oxygen. And then, before it died, a simple mechanism at the top of the bowl reintroduced air inside. The scientist here has delayed the reintroduction, causing considerable suspense as we see in the reactions of the two girls. Yet their father, the voice of reason, attempts to dispel their fears. The dramatic, Caravagesque lighting not only underscores the bird's balance of life and death, but also suggests that science brings light into an otherwise dark world of ignorance. Now, on that note, Rococo wasn't ubiquitous in France. In the 1760s, there was a strong reaction to Rococo painters, such as Fragonard and Boucher, that we define vaguely as quote unquote natural art, which is the return to more natural, down to earth themes. I'll try in this lecture to help you understand that there were different styles of the quote unquote natural in France, England, the United States, and in Italy, because each culture had different choices of ordinary life, the natural world, and sentimentality as subjects in art. A leading detractor of Rococo in France was Denis Diderot, an Enlightenment figure whom many regard as the father of modern art criticism. His highest praise went to Jean-Baptiste Greuze, which is hardly surprising because Greuze's major source of inspiration came from the kind of middle-class drama that Diderot wrote plays about. Greuze's moral tale here illustrates a social tenet of Rousseau, that the poor, in contrast to the immoral aristocracy, are full of natural virtue and honest sentiment. Everything is intended to remind us of this point. From the theatrical gestures and expressions of the actors to the smallest detail, one of the chicks gathered around the hen in the foreground has left the brood and sits alone on a saucer, like the bride who is about to leave her own brood. Even the royal court had room for more natural approaches, or at least a medley of naturalism and Rococo. The elegant informality continued to be featured, but new themes were introduced. Figures tended to be larger and more robust, and compositional arrangements were more stable. In an interesting development, many of the leading portraitists were women. Marie-Louise Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun became a painter for Queen Marie Antoinette and had a very high status in the royal court. This particular piece by Vigée-Lebrun portrays Queen Marie Antoinette with her children in conformity with the Enlightenment theme of morality. In this case, the Good Mother. It's probably one of the best attempts of several by various artists at conveying her as a kindly, stabilizing presence for her children, a piece of propaganda to offset her public image as a selfish, extravagant, immoral person. In 1783, Vigée-Lebrun was elected to one of the 4 places in the French Academy available to women. Along with her was Adelaide Labille-Guiard, who successfully petitioned to end the restriction on women. Her commitment to enlarging the number of women painters in France is evident in this self-portrait with her 2 pupils. This monumental image of the artist at the easel was also meant to vanquish sexist rumors that her paintings and those by her contemporaries like Vigée-Lebrun had actually been painted by men. The only male in her work is her muse, her father, whose bust appears behind her. While she flatters herself with conventional feminine charms, she is a strong departure from the Rococo women of artists like Fragonard. Labille-Guiard isn't a cream puff or an object of pleasure. She is a monumental figure in this composition, composed, professional, fashionable, and a leader. This model of femininity was important in keeping with her conception of women as significant contributors to national life, which really is an impulse of the Enlightenment. Although Rococo never got a real foothold on British soil, English artists still felt its influence, like a fresh breeze from across the English Channel. Without becoming flamboyant, a new, lighter look infused with English art. England hadn't had a major painter of its own in 200 years, but in the 18th century it had three: William Hogarth, Joshua Reynolds, and Thomas Gainsborough. The latter two of which were heavily influenced by Watteau, and as well as Italian Renaissance and Baroque artists, and Dutch and Flemish painting. Because British patrons preferred portraits of themselves to classical historical paintings, Gainsborough, like others, catered largely to rich and fashionable individuals. Ms. Richard Brinsley was a professional singer, the wife of a celebrated playwright, uh, and she's been seated here outdoors. The way that the sloping view into the distance and the use of the tree to frame her head seems to have been borrowed from Anthony van Dyck, an artist that we looked at last term. Here's a quick comparison just so that you can see what I'm talking about here regarding the artificial composition of quote-unquote natural elements around the individual. With Van Dyck, the branches bow, and as well even the horse bows to the king. However, Gainsborough has modernized his approach, not simply through his lighter Rococo palette and feathery brushwork, but also by integrating the woman into the landscape and demonstrating a connection between the two. Even her wind-blown hair matches the tree foliage above. The work thereby manifests one of the new values of the Enlightenment, the emphasis on nature and the natural source of virtue and beauty. Sir Joshua Reynolds was another key British artist of the era, who presented the Royal Academy with numerous discourses on art theory. Famously, he believed that artists should follow the rules derived from studying the great masters of classicism, and that the highest kinds of art were history paintings. However, since British preferred portraiture, and since Reynolds liked money, he attempted to elevate portraiture to the level of history painting by giving it a historical or mythological veneer, a technique he called the grand manner. Beauty and virtue are still very important and still very connected to nature, as per the reigning contemporary philosophers would have argued. And thus, people are prominently placed in natural settings, and their virtues here, heroicism, valor, patriotism, are extolled as developments of character, not inherited from aristocratic blood. And that is the underlying emphasis here. But because of his relatively novel expression of courage, valor, and heroism, Reynolds was very influential to subsequent artists handling the themes of battle and courage. One thing that you may have noticed by now is that, I guess in many of my ramblings and in your readings, is that most of these artists have an international character to them, at least in their training and aesthetic influence. It also wasn't just artists making the pilgrimage to Italy and other cultural meccas, but educated people of all classes, a journey commonly known as the Grand Tour, or Grand Tour. And a phenomenon that even exists in the United States today to a certain degree. It is fashionable or traditional for some to make a European tour after graduating and gaining a better understanding of the world and culture. During the 18th century, it was also the norm to bring back souvenirs, but they often weren't cheap magnets of Van Gogh paintings or snow globes of the Roman Colosseum. They were paintings by foreign artistic masters. In a sense, a trophy or a status symbol. The art market reflected this taste for uh, exotic art and was very accommodating of artists like Angelica Kauffmann, a Swiss-born, Italian-trained history painter who found great success in London. History painting, with subjects rooted in classical literature and history, the Bible, and mythology, was highly regarded in European academies and had essentially two functions. It was conceived as a timeless beauty to please the senses, and or it was a vehicle for intelligently conveying Enlightenment ideals. So, Cornelia, pointing to her children as her treasures, is a prime example of this, with the origins of its subject matter in classical antiquity. In the ancient Roman story, a woman visitor has been showing off her jewels to Cornelia, and then asks her about hers. And Cornelia's response is a gesture to her sons and says, "These are my most precious jewels." You can see how such paintings were the didactic manifestation of Enlightenment critics. Cornelia exemplifies the quote-unquote good mother, a popular subject among later 18th century history painters, who would often depict subjects that teach lessons of virtue. Kaufmann's devotion to Neoclassicism was at first shared by her American-born friend Benjamin West, who, after studying in Philadelphia, also went to Rome and later moved permanently to London. West shocked his academic contemporaries with the death of General Wolfe, because instead of clothing his figures in ancient costume, as was the norm with Neoclassicism, he chose to depict them with contemporary clothing. Pretty much everyone he knew warned him against doing this, but in the end it worked out for him. In this highly dramatized account of a British battle in Quebec, West has made strategic alterations to the composition. Instead of showing the general at the base of a tree with 2 or 3 attendants, as it occurred, he lays the body of the general under a dramatic sky. Note the emphasis on nature. And has arranged the figures and objects, like the flag, into a powerful geometric scheme. For exotic interests and as an emblem of nature, West added a Native American, which was a blatant superimposition because the Native Americans were fighting side by side with the French against the British. And the arrangement of the figures around the general's body intentionally recalls the well-established pictorial tradition of representing the lamentation of Christ. Thus, West conveys his ultimate moral here. Just as Christ died for humanity, Wolfe, and moreover a good soldier, sacrifices himself for the good of the state. I should also mention that the emotional intensity and creativity of this work aided in launching the Romantic movement in British painting. Finally, our last painting of this lecture, before we move on to architecture, the Oath of the Orati by Jacques-Louis David, who dominated neoclassical painting in France and much of Europe, really. His anti-Rococo paintings were truly neoclassical in that they were a medium for improving public morals. They were a product of more natural tendencies and Enlightenment thought, in that they eulogized the antique virtues of Stoicism, masculinity, and patriotism, and thusly became, in a way, an emblem for the French Revolution of 1789. The story recounted here, the 17th century drama Horace, deals with the early Republican period of Roman history, when the warring neighbor city-states, Rome and Alba, decided to settle the conflict with a single fight to the death with the three best soldiers of each side. Here, the three sons of Horus were chosen to represent Rome, and they, with their father, pledge an oath to the state. Interestingly, David has chosen to contrast the angular muscularity of these men with a group of languid, weeping women and frightened children. The contrast heightens the men's stoic willingness of self-sacrifice for the state, and the emotional commitment of the women and children to family ties. Okay, there's a lot to go into with this work, but unfortunately we have to keep moving. In contrast to painting, French architects of the late 18th century generally considered classicism not one of several alternative styles, but the one true style. Representative of most traditionalists were Jacques Chamon Soufflot and his masterpiece, the Church of Saint-Geneviève, which is known today simply as the Panthéon. The building has a strange and long history, which I can't get into too much here, but I can say that before it was completed as a church, the French revolutionaries took it over, and were going to sell it for much needed cash. But Napoleon turned it into a temple of fame for the heroes of liberty. Since then, it was re-sanctified as a Catholic church, then later as a non-denominational lay temple, and later still, it was used as a physics laboratory. With the Panthéon, Soufflot attempted to integrate three traditions. The Roman architecture he observed on tour, French and English Baroque classicism, and the Palladian style that was coming into fashion in England. The facade, with its enormous portico, was modeled directly after ancient Roman temples, but the dome was inspired by St. Paul's Cathedral in London. I can recommend flipping back a chapter to the Baroque in Northern Europe for a more thorough comparison. Yet one of the most important aspects here is the influence of Andrea Palladio, to which St. Paul's is also greatly indebted, which comes out here in the radical geometry of its plan. The Greek cross layout has a prominent status in architectural history, starting with Christian architecture, but it was appropriated for a myriad of architectural layouts over the centuries. Even for the private Chiswick house that we're going to look at now. This home was designed by Richard Boyle after the Palladian villa that we just looked at, sharing its geometric symmetry. The entrance, flanked now by matching staircases, imitates Roman temple fronts, which is a not-so-subtle complement to those living in the house. The elevation is also characteristically Palladian, with the main floor resting on the basement, and tall rectangular windows with triangular pediments. But unlike France, where classicism ruled, the English embraced the revival of other historical styles more readily, of which Strawberry Hill is a shining example. The Gothic revival was spearheaded largely by conservative politician and author Horace Walpole, who decided to remodel his home in the Gothic manner. The inside is absolutely incredible. But you can see from the exterior a part of what he dedicated nearly 30 years to remodeling, transforming his house into a Gothic castle, complete with crenellated battlements, tracery windows, and turrets. With what began at the grounds of the Chiswick house, the tradition of the English landscape garden became immensely popular, which stood in stark contrast to the regularity and rigidity of the geometric French Baroque gardens. Instead of an overall angular structure, paths meandered and winded around a lake with a cascade. Uh, Irregular plantings of shrubs and other effects imitated a natural rural landscape, an indication of the growing Enlightenment emphasis on the natural. However, the grounds of the Stourhead estate were precisely architected into a picturesque composition of natural elements and carefully placed buildings, like this replica of the Roman Pantheon in the background. The calculated orchestration of these physical elements was the real-life composition of the landscape aesthetic pioneered by 17th century landscape painters like Claude Lorrain, who was quite beloved in England. The flair for exotic elements here uh, is an indication, or at least an early indication, of the romantic taste for the strange and novel, which we get to look at next week. Thus, this garden is an unique synthesis of neoclassical and romantic aesthetics. Jumping across the pond, we have time to briefly examine the neoclassical or federal style as the national style of architecture in the United States in the early 19th century. We are all fairly familiar with Thomas Jefferson for his political contributions in American history, but he was also a self-taught architect who, before the American Revolution, shared the British aristocratic preference for Palladian design, which he discovered as the American minister to France. When he came back to the States, he completely redesigned Monticello, using French doors, tall, narrow windows, and even a balustrade above, right here, in an attempt to make his home appear as a single story. The building's simplicity and the combination of temple front and dome remain closer to the Chiswick house than contemporary French architecture. But compared to the Chiswick house, Jefferson's home appears less pretentious, thanks to its humbler building materials of brick, wood, and stucco, as well as because of its smaller scale and lower profile. Speaking of humility, here is a decent note to end this week's lecture on. Because he had done such outstanding work on the bust of Benjamin Franklin, the American ambassador to France, the Virginia State Legislature commissioned neoclassical French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon to do a portrait of its native son, George Washington. The resulting life-size marble figure embodies the period's love for the natural, and the revival of classicism that was shaping the Republican politics of the American forefathers. Like the approach we saw in West's Death of General Wolfe, George Washington is dressed in a general's uniform. His serene expression and relaxed contrapposto pose have their origins in the sculpted athletes of ancient Greece. His left hand rests on a bundle of 13 rods, representing the original states, which are bound with an axe face, a Roman symbol of authority. Houdon's workshop focused on producing replicas of such work as part of the cult of great men promoted by Enlightenment thinkers as models for all humanity. All right, that does it for this week, everyone, or well, for today, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you'll join me next week.